Welcome to this mini workshop on essay writing. In particular, it's going to focus on the basics, the fundamentals of writing a university level essay. So one indispensable element of all university essays is a clear thesis. I'm surprised often at the 1000 level how few papers actually have a discernible, clear, and succinct thesis. Now, this isn't like a high school course where you can simply present your idea. You are like a lawyer presenting a clear argument, and your task is to convince your audience, in this case the professor, the marker, the larger educated public, about the correctness of your interpretation. So one big difference between high school level essays versus university level essays is the presence of an argument. We're looking for your opinion, yes, but you are not the authority. A thesis means that you have a clear argument that you are able to validate with evidence. Now, online I've presented a model guide with various theses presenting the basic model through which you can do this for the various topics that have been assigned. There's a few rules of thumb. First of all, it's very important that your thesis is a concise encapsulation of your main argument. Some students write a functional thesis. In other words, they'll say, I'm going to argue this, 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 and that. That works okay, but it's much better to have a very succinct summary of the main point you're going to write. So if you're going to write about post-colonial Africa, you would make an argument about what you believe to be the essence of neocolonialism in Africa. Now, another requirement, which seems to be pretty straightforward, but sometimes is forgotten, is that you are presented with a question. So you have to conceptualize your project, create your argument so that it points to answer the question that has been presented to you. Now, according to convention, the thesis is always at the end of your introductory paragraph. Now, there are some stylistic differences, and when you're writing longer pieces rather than short essays, there's some divergence. But for anyone writing a 3 to 4 page essay, there's really very little reason to defy convention. The reader expects the thesis to be at the end of the introductory paragraph, and it's beneficial to place it there. Now, your thesis, or your main argument, is part of a larger instrument, the introduction, which is setting the stage for what you're going to investigate in your research essay. One element, structural element of the introduction, is the introductory sentence, the first sentence. You have to think of this like a fish lure. You're dangling this in the water. What you're trying to do is to attract your audience into the subject. So in that sense, what you want to have is something that's attractive. A bait that looks like a real fish that's going to want people to want to enter in. It also has to be clear. You never want to have a 3 or 4 line sentence. Something that's clear, succinct, and provocative tends to work best. So the best introductory sentences are extremely short. They might be 3 or 5 words long. Hitler was a madman. Right away it draws the reader in, and then the next sentence would kind of explore, introduce the topic more. Now, in addition to drawing the reader in, you have to kind of set up what your project's going to investigate. So what is the historical problem? Are you going to investigate the Arab reaction to UN Resolution 181? Well, explain what you are investigating. You might want to introduce the particular approach you're going to take to the topic. A lot of these things have been investigated a lot by established historians in much longer books. So what you have to establish is, what are you going to take as part of your problem? What is your case study? What is your method that you're going to use that's going to contribute to the conventional wisdom, the established historiography, what other historians have said, the status of the question that you're investigating? And after you've set this all up, then you want to have your main argument. This is telling your reader, this is what I'm setting out to prove in this particular essay. What I've provided here is a sample introduction. You can see all the main elements here. I'll just give you a few minutes to read it yourself. Now this is the opening sentence. It's a bit longer than some, but it generally works in the sense of it clearly introduces the topic and presents the idea that there's a conflict between the idea of civilizing and the violence that accompany the scramble for Africa. Subsequently, the introductory paragraph sets up the subject in terms of this central contradiction, hypocrisy that was involved in new imperialism. And it tries to relate the idea of violence to profit and the cultural idea of civilizing. What was the relationship between these three dimensions? Subsequently, it focuses on certain case studies, and then it presents a thesis which I have put in italics so that it's clearly visible. In the final analysis, Europe's civilizing mission was simply a lofty way of whitewashing the brutal transformation of Africa to serve European needs and ends, regardless of its humanitarian cost. So this is essentially a basic statement about what you want to argue. The rest of your paper is going to sit about proving this. So what are the main arguments that you have to develop in your paper? Well, your introduction sets up the stage. Your thesis defines what you're setting out to prove. And when you're dealing with a broader topic, you kind of have to provide the historical context. So what was the scramble for Africa in the case of this paper? There's the Conference of Berlin. There's all these countries that are going in and staking their flags in various ways. What were the issues that were related to this scramble, particularly the violence and European politics that was involved? So you're basically taking the general topic and explaining, provide a context, a general context for the reader. Subsequently, another section you should at least start to incorporate, even at the 1000 level, is what have historians already said? I mean, this is not something that's new. Historians have looked at the scramble for Africa, or UN Resolution 181, or the origin of the Cold War in excessive volume. So what you need to do is to summarize the conventional wisdom. You have to look at a book review, a literature review, take a classic text, and summarize what some of the historians have said about this subject. This establishes the conventional wisdom, the orthodoxy that rules this particular topic. Then you have your own investigation. What are you going to explore? What are you going to contribute to the collective wisdom? In this case, it could be a case study of Leopold's Congo to highlight how these dimensions of violence, profit, and the presumption of the civilizing mission came together to reveal its true essence. Obviously, what happened in the Congo is not the same as Namibia or British South Africa or some other country in Africa. Subsequently, you might have, if your thesis is really focused on the idea of racial violence, provide something of a typology of this. So there's various episodes of violence. What seems to be their nature? What seems to be their origin? How are the people perpetuating this violence seem to think about it? In this way, you're providing the broader scope of violence during the scramble of Africa. So once you've kind of explored the topic and validated your thesis, then you can go back to the beginning. Talk about how your thesis contributes to historically established wisdom and how you have demonstrated it with the various things that you have explored. There are certain golden rules that you want to follow. A history essay is not an English essay. It's not a political science essay. History is an empirical discipline. It's based upon facts, minute details. So your writing, your argument needs to reflect this. It's okay to have theories and general summaries, But if you're going to do a historical paper, it means going at the retail level. Particular aspects of violence in the Congo, unique events, particular people, dates, facts. Now, one of the flaws that I tend to see is that, especially with students that don't have a lot of experience in essay writing, is they use long block quotes. This is kind of used as a filler to kind of prevent you from analyzing it in depth. So you don't want to do that. If you're going to quote something, generally you're going to quote a primary source rather than a secondary source. If you're going to quote a secondary source, that's good, but then make it sure it's a famous historian who's arguing something about the phenomenon that's indispensable for your argument. But the reason that you quote something is because this is evidence for your argument. If it doesn't meet that test, it shouldn't be in your paper. You're not trying to show the grader that you've done research. You're trying to develop an argument. It's also important not to paraphrase or put words into the mouth of the historians that you're quoting or the source of the time. There's quite a few times where I see students paraphrasing what, for instance, Churchill said and doing this inaccurately, in the sense plagiarizing or putting words into his mouth. So you want to avoid that. Let the source speak for itself. After the text is there, his words are there, then you can render your interpretations of what you think it means. It's very important to use neutral language, and whatever our culture, our political culture, there's a tendency to label people as this person's bad, this person's brave, and everything else. History is supposed to be objective, so you want to use neutral language. In your conclusion, if you want to unload and make kind of more moral judgments that what Stalin did was heinous, then maybe you can start to bring a little bit of it in. But your argument's a lot stronger if you let the facts speak for itself. I mean, if Stalin killed 5 million people in the Ukraine, the fact speaks for itself. You calling him a madman or evil doesn't add anything to your argument. In fact, that's a form of logical fallacy. I often notice that when it comes to quotes that students have some bad practices. You have to remember that when you're quoting, this is part of your evidence that you're marshaling to prove your case to the jury, to the audience. So you want to avoid the block quotes, as I said. Another thing you want to do, since it's a short essay, is you can't do long quotes. Maybe just highlight the essential elements. So if Truman and the Truman Doctrine, you can't summarize or give long quotes of it, you might just say, well, he asserted leadership over the free world. The free world is this important idea that he introduced that repositioned the United States in terms of its foreign policy. As a general rule, you try to quote the primary sources rather than the secondary sources, but it depends. If you're dealing with historiography, summarizing what other historians have said, obviously then you will be citing quoting the secondary sources. Now, a big area of improvement is simply the art of writing. There's a science to essay construction. Writing is largely an art. Some people are very good at writing, other people are not. But one of the things important to keep in mind is that as a craft, as an art, your ability to write and communicate through written language is a continual process of improving. I've been writing for 30 years. I tend to write 4 or 5 hours a day. But still, I'm learning and improving my craft. So none of you at the 1000 level are polished writers yet. Some of you are very good writers, in some ways better than even established historians. But even if you have this skill, you have to be conscious of certain rules of thumbs. One of the things that's important to avoid are generalizations. You have to provide clear examples. The more you can get to the retail level, the level of fact, humans, individual protagonists doing particular things at particular times, this is when you avoid generalizations. You're going to need to have some generalizations. Your thesis is a type of generalization. If you're making an argument about Nkrumah's post-colonial thought, it's a generalization because you're talking about or generalizing about his whole book. That's fine. But as much as possible, you want to avoid generalizations, because what this means is that you're confusing the reader. A term like economic or situation could mean lots of different things. You want to have concrete terms. David Ben-Gurion, we're talking about the West Bank. Don't just group all Arabs together. Distinguish Palestinian Arabs from Arab leaders in neighboring states. Distinguish Zionists from Jews outside of Israel versus doves or liberal Jews living inside Israel before the establishment of the state. So the more specific you can be in terms of the West, Arabs, Egyptian forces, etc., this renders your argument more clear. You should avoid colloquial expressions at all time. I mean, we're not in a bar. This is a formal argument. So things like knocked him as dead as a doornail, these are expressions you tend to not use. You want to avoid the passive voice. Use active verbs rather than using is, was, were constructions. Start with a concrete subject. Say exactly what they did. Describe who was affected by this and what time it happened. One of the plagues that I see among weaker writers is redundancy. And if you know this might be a problem, you're going to have to really proofread your article carefully. At the worst case, sometimes I can see a paragraph where you're basically repeating the same sentence 4 times in 4 different ways. The easiest way to avoid this is simply to outline your paper. If you have your main arguments, you, in your outline, put various quotes and citations. You should avoid redundancy. And of course, given the low word count, you're really going to need to save your canvas and use every last inch of space. And you can't afford to have any redundancy. Now, citations. Obviously, every paper needs to have citations. Sometimes students ask me, well, how many citations do you need? It's a hard question to answer because it really depends on your style. It depends on the type of paper you're writing, etc. There's a couple, rules of thumbs about this. First of all, you have to understand that there is such a thing as general knowledge. You're not writing this to your little sister or your mother who might know nothing about history, might not know what the Truman Doctrine was or the Berlin Crisis was. You have to assume that you're writing to a historical audience that has this base knowledge. This is already established. Even if in a case of a student, you're not necessarily an expert in this particular material. So what you're quoting or citing are particular things, ideas that you borrowed from secondary sources, quotes from primary sources. Now, how many citations are there in an average student paper? I would say there's about 3 or 4 per page is the normal. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's only 1 if it's a particular type of page on a paper. There's no, exact answer, but the general rule of thumb in a 3 to 4 page papers, there's going to be 6 to 15 citations. Now, this is the history discipline, so you have to use the mechanics of the historical discipline, which means the Chicago style. So no parenthetical MLA style citations, which are used in other discipline. When you are citing something, you always have to include the page numbers, not just the source. We need both footnotes and bibliography. Some of you think that if you cite or have a footnote, you don't need the bibliography. Or if you have a bibliography, you don't need footnotes. And it's true when you have a 3-page paper, it seems to be redundant to do this. But you're learning the discipline of history. You're apprenticing in this craft. The footnotes and the bibliography are different mechanisms, and you need to do both on your paper. If you're in doubt, if you've read heavily from a source and you're not sure if it's common knowledge or this is really an argument which is unique to this author, just cite it. That way you're always safe. It's hard to say you can really oversight. You might be oversighting, but you won't get in trouble for it. If you don't cite it, on the other hand, you can get in trouble. So when in doubt, cite. So the Chicago style has certain basics. Unlike the MLA style, it has a lot of information to help people find the information that you cited or quoted. And this is very important, particularly when you're dealing with archival sources. But this allows another reader to find the fact or text that you have established. Now, the style for the notation depends on whether it's a scholarly article or a book chapter, etc. Basically, what you need to go is to the History Department Essay Guide. I would encourage all history majors for sure to read this front to back. But it has a good section on how the main format of citations are for these various sources. Now, having read many of these papers, there are certain common pitfalls that I see that just reoccur and recur. So I would encourage you to avoid those. Make sure that you have a clear thesis. That's why I say, put it in italics. That's fine. If it's in italics, it's there. You can see it. The TA can see it. It really clarifies what you're trying to argue. Try to avoid logical fallacies. I've mentioned some of them in this presentation, not very many. There's a separate workshop and handout that deals with these. You should check that out if you know that you're prone to this. Work on your prose. Everyone is a unique writer. You have some gifts as a writer, some shortcomings. Try to work over the course of your university career in terms of improving as a writer. What are your weaknesses? What are your strengths? And how can your awareness of these strengths and weaknesses help you to work and improve on your prose? The number one failing I see in student essays is insufficient research. I mean, this is a history essay. It's a research essay, even if it's a short essay. If you haven't mastered the topic, how can you make a meaningful argument? Now, based on high school, I mean, there was some bad practices. Research was basically Googling. If you found, the first thing you found on Google, some web page, you slapped on the page and that would be research. That's not the way research works at the university level. You have to really invest a lot of time there. Generally, what I see is that students invest 10% in research, 90% in the production of the document, and that should be reversed. You should spend 90% researching. Once you've researched the topic and understand it, making an argument and validating it is easy. The paper will write itself. And this is why I go back to this virtue of outlining and why outlining is so important. When you're outlining, it helps your mind to figure out what your main arguments are and to verify that your arguments are verifying what your thesis is presenting. Again, be careful with your quotations. This is often misused. Only use quotations if this is an essential element in your proof. A lot of high school essays you're taught, and this isn't necessarily incorrect, the 5-paragraph model. You have an introduction, you have 3 arguments, there are 3 separate paragraphs, and then you have the conclusion. As a general model, that's fine. But you have to remember that you have to have a sophisticated argument that flows from thesis through the body and the proofs to the conclusion. This is just a very brief mini workshop. Of course, there's more resources online. The Anatomy of an Essay genre goes into more detail of the essential elements of an essay. The Writing with Power handout deals with particular examples of student prose and shows you pitfalls that are illustrated there and how you can rewrite that sentence so it's effective. In the 7 Deadly Sins, what I've collected again is some concrete examples of errors that I typically see on student papers, particularly the errors that affect your grade. So it might be a good document to consult before you move to your final draft. In Research in the Digital Age, I discuss various methods to efficiently and quickly locate scholarly sources that you can use to argue your essay. Since research is so important, you can make your arguments a lot more powerful if you're more efficient at getting good material rather than less quality material. How to cite, if you have any questions about when you should use a footnote or not, there's a more detailed guide on that. And of course, the standby resource, the Departmental Essay Guide, has a lot more detail. And if you're a history major, like I said again, I think it's very useful that you read this, not only one time from cover to cover, but that you can refer to it again and again as a resource for various aspects of the essay production process.